The river bit first. A clean, sharp bite. Cold through the oar handle. Cold in his bones. George did not curse. He never did. He let the chill settle, breathed it in, and kept the boat sliding along the old morning route. Fog skimmed the low banks like a stray animal. The sun was awake but shy, pale behind gauze. Water whispered under the keel. The town behind him breathed in its sleep. He rowed the same way he always rowed. Slow. Economical. Each stroke a habit older than grief. The river knew him. He liked to believe that. He had given it years and secrets. It had taken his silence and fed him enough to live. Fair trade. He reached the quiet bend. Deep water. A pocket of stillness tucked behind a knuckled root and a spill of reeds. Fish liked the dark there. He dropped the net with practiced care. No splash. Just a soft swallow, as if the water accepted an offering. Then he waited. He had learned waiting from his father. From hard winters. From hospital chairs. Waiting can be companionship if you let it. He sat with the grey air. Let the damp creep through his jacket. Listened to a woodpecker arguing with a hollow trunk across the bend. Thought of nothing large. A minute became 5. 5 turned into the slow stretch of river time. He drew the net. Weight. Too much weight. His shoulders complained. The rope burned in his palms, rough and loyal. The net did not give, then gave a little, then fought again. Come on, he said. Not to the river. Not to whatever was down there. To his own old arms. Something thudded against the hull. Not the frantic knock of fish. Not driftwood, either. Solid. Dense. As if the river had swallowed a chunk of the past and was not sure it wanted to spit it out. He leaned harder. The net tore surface. Not silver. Not scales. Not a log. A shape broke free of the slick greens, coughing up silt and weed. Metal. Boxy. Heavy. A camera. The kind you see in family albums from 50 years ago. Square jaw. Steel bones. Glass eye clouded to milk. A leather strap dangled like a dead snake, half chewed by time. George stared. The river dripped off the thing in brown tears. He pulled it into the boat and set it by his boots. It thudded with a finality that felt rude to the morning. He could have tossed it back. Junk. A story that wasn't his. But the pastor's weight, and this one had found his hands. He touched the corroded housing with his thumb. Grit came away like old ash. He remembered a different camera, bright Kodak plastic, his wife's careful fingers, the click of summer. The way a small square could freeze a laugh and hold it forever. The memory tasted warm and hurt anyway. He looked upriver. No one was watching. The fog had thickened. The world had narrowed to boat, man, metal box. He finished his route out of habit, not hunger. The nets offered a modest answer, but his eyes kept sliding to the camera as if it might blink, as if it might speak. Back at the dock, the wood groaned under his weight. He tied off, lifted gear, lifted that stubborn block of years. It was heavier than it looked. Weight is not only weight. He walked through town with the camera wrapped in an old towel inside his bag. Main Street yawned awake. Early coffee. Newspaper racks. A truck downshifting somewhere in the haze. People nodded at him because that is what small towns do. He nodded back without focus. The workshop near the edge of the street was still dark. A window crowded with relics, radios, keys that had lost their doors, typewriters that would never again be angry at ink. Henry would open later. Henry knew old machines the way a watchmaker knows time itself. If any person could pull breath out of this drowned thing, it was Henry. George went home. He set the camera on the kitchen table. The thin winter light cut across its face and picked out scars. Water seeped onto the wood and drew pale circles like the moon at low tide. He slid a towel beneath it, then sat down and poured coffee he did not want. He looked at the camera. It did not look back. What do you do with a found life? Throw it away? Keep it until it becomes furniture? Pretend it never asked your name? The house was quiet. Too quiet. He had grown used to that silence, but now it felt crowded, like the air was full of people holding their breath. He stood, paced once, sat again. He turned the camera gently, tried the cold wheel that refused to move. The shutter lever was glued by rust. The back panel, too. Sealed by time and river. Under the ruined leather, the faint stamp of a model number still showed. Letters from another decade. He traced them the way a man traces a gravestone. He thought of film. He thought of ghosts carved in silver. Film survives more than you think. He had heard that somewhere. In a magazine. In a story told over bait buckets. Emulsion, stubborn as a promise. Water ruins most things. Not always memory. He breathed out and decided. Tomorrow. Henry. The decision settled him. He cleaned the kettle, rinsed the mug, wiped the table. Every small motion felt like stage business before a first line. The camera stayed where it was, thick with a quiet he could feel in his teeth. Evening came early. Fog gave way to low clouds that pressed on the town like a hand. He ate without tasting. He turned on the radio, then turned it off. He stood in the doorway and watched the last light slide from the edge of the world. When he went to bed, he left the kitchen door open. He could see the table. He could see the black shape on the towel. It looked almost dignified. Like a guest. Like a relic. Like a dare. Sleep came in thin sheets. He woke and checked again. The thing did not move. Of course it didn't. Yet each time he looked, he felt the same tug. The same wordless summons. By dawn he had a new kind of ache. Not in the hands. Not in the back. Deeper. A redness. He swung his feet to the cold floor. He looked one last time at the camera and felt the river in his bones again. Icy, insistent, alive. All right, he said to the morning. Let's see what you've brought. George rose before the sun, as always. But this morning was not like the others. The air felt heavier. His house, usually silent, seemed filled with a presence. He knew why. The camera. It still sat on the kitchen table, where he had left it the night before, wrapped in its shroud of rust and silt. Waiting. He moved quietly, as though he didn't want to disturb it. The kettle hissed, the old floorboards creaked, and yet his eyes kept drifting back to the dark shape. The river had given him fish before. Driftwood. Sometimes junk. But never this. He poured his coffee and sat down across from the relic. It looked different in daylight, less like a piece of trash, more like a survivor. The towel beneath it was still damp. Small stains had bled onto the wood, rings that seemed almost deliberate, like marks left behind on purpose. George sipped. The taste of coffee was flat. All his thoughts circled the same point. Why this? Why me? The past is stubborn. It clings. He remembered his wife's hands, slim and steady, cradling her own camera on bright afternoons. She used to say that photographs were little anchors, proof that happiness had really happened. George had never cared much for being in pictures, but he had liked the sound of the shutter. A click that froze laughter. A sound that said you matter, this moment matters. Looking at the drowned camera, he wondered. Whose laughter had it captured? Whose faces might be locked inside? Had the river protected them, or buried them? By the time he finished his cup, he knew he couldn't simply throw it out. It wasn't trash. It was a story, pressed silent into corroded metal. And stories deserved to be told. There was only one man in town who might coax it open. Henry. Henry's workshop sat at the far end of Main Street. Everyone knew it. A narrow little shop crowded with half-dead machines. Radios with cracked dials. Typewriters with jammed keys. Clocks that ticked out of rhythm but still ticked. Henry had patience. And a stubbornness for old things. If anyone could rescue the memory inside, it was him. George checked the clock. Too early. Henry would not open until mid-morning. Still, he couldn't sit still. He wrapped the camera in a dry towel and slid it into his fishing bag. The weight pulled at his shoulder with every step, as if reminding him of its presence. The town was waking. Screen doors squeaked. Newspapers hit porches. The bakery vented its first warm breath of bread. George walked past it all, nodding absently at neighbors. They waved back, unaware that the old fisherman carried something strange, something heavy with years. The workshop was dark, just as he knew it would be. The window cluttered with its silent witnesses, radios, records, and forgotten tools. George stood there a while, shifting on his feet, feeling the pull of the object in his bag. He could wait. He had waited all his life. Back at home, he placed the camera on the table once more. The same spot. The same silent challenge. He studied it closely now, in the thin light that slanted through his curtains. The shutter was frozen shut. The back latch sealed. But what if the film inside had survived? The thought stirred him. Film was fragile, yet stubborn. It clung to light the way memory clings to grief. Even after years, decades, there might still be shadows preserved within. Shadows of people, places, events, evidence. George sat there for a long time, staring, tracing the ridges of corrosion with his fingertip. He should have felt foolish. An old man, sitting with an old machine, as if it could speak. Yet he didn't. The longer he stared, the stronger the feeling grew. This was not an accident. It had been meant for him. Not the man on the other side of town. Not the boy fishing upriver. Him. The day crawled. He fixed a sandwich he didn't eat. He set a line in the river but couldn't focus on the tug. Every sound, the creak of his chair, the tick of his clock, felt like noise in the way of the camera silence. At last, he decided, tomorrow would be too late. He would bring it to Henry today. Evening dropped over the town like a heavy coat. George sat once more at the table, the camera between him and the cooling light of the window. He whispered to it, though he didn't mean to. "All right," he said. "Tomorrow we open you. Whatever's inside, we face it." The house swallowed his words, but the vow hung in the air, solid and real. For the first time in years, he felt anticipation in his blood instead of the dull ache of repetition. The river had given him something. Not fish. Not driftwood. Something more dangerous. A secret. The morning broke slow, thick with mist. George barely slept. Every time his eyes closed, the image returned, the camera on his table, watching him. He woke before dawn, restless, and brewed coffee strong enough to shake the cobwebs. The decision was set. Today he would take it to Henry. He wrapped the camera carefully, layer after layer of old towel, as though cradling a fragile animal. The bag hung heavy against his side as he stepped into the street. Main Street stirred to life. The bakery's door swung open with a sigh of warm bread. Neighbors called greetings, but George barely heard them. His steps were slow, deliberate, like he carried something sacred. Henry's shop waited at the far end. A crooked building with cluttered windows full of relics, radios with missing knobs, broken gramophones, a rusted cash register that no one had used in half a century. The bell above the door clinked as he entered. Inside smelled of oil and dust, the perfume of machines long dead but not forgotten. Behind a workbench sat Henry, thin shoulders hunched, glasses sliding down his nose, his hands stained from tinkering. He looked up and smiled faintly. "George, haven't seen you in a while. What brings you in?" George didn't answer at first. He placed the bundle on the bench and unfolded it with slow care. The camera sat there, scarred by rust, dripping with the weight of years. Henry's eyes widened. He leaned closer, curiosity sharpening his face. "Well, I'll be damned," he whispered. He lifted the camera gently, as if afraid it might crumble. Turned it this way, then that. Adjusted his glasses. Ran a finger over the corroded seams. "This is old. Mid-century, maybe 60s. Been underwater a long time." He tried the shutter. Stuck. He tried the latch. Sealed. Then, with patient pressure, he pried the back open. A pause. A breath. A small, reverent whisper. "There's film inside." George leaned in, his heart thumping harder than he liked to admit. "Is it ruined?" he asked. Henry shrugged slowly. "Maybe. Maybe not. Film can surprise you. Sometimes, even after decades, the emulsion holds on. If we are lucky, something's still there." He glanced up, eyes bright. "Do you want me to try?" George nodded without hesitation. They moved into the back room. The air was heavy with chemicals. The faint red glow of a safe light painted the walls. It felt like stepping into a chapel. Henry's hands moved with practiced grace. He unwound the brittle film slowly, coaxing it into life. Dipped it into trays of liquid that smelled sharp and acrid. Swirled it gently. George stood close, hardly breathing, as shadows began to bloom on the paper. At first, nothing but pale shapes. Blurs. Then, slowly, the outline sharpened. Faces. A man, tall and broad-shouldered, smiling at the lens. A woman, hair swept back, holding the hand of a small boy. A girl, clutching a doll against her chest. A family. Ordinary. Alive. Frozen in the moment the shutter clicked. Photograph after photograph appeared, strung on a line to dry. Picnics on the grass. Children running through fields. The woman's quiet devotion as she looked at the man beside her. George's chest tightened. He didn't know them, not truly, but their faces spoke to him. Real people. Real joy. A past suddenly alive in his hands. Then something shifted. In several photos, behind the family, half in shadow, stood another figure. A young man. Thin. Serious. Always near, never central. Sometimes blurred, sometimes caught in profile. George stared. Recognition hit like cold water. Thomas Hale, he whispered. The name rolled heavy off his tongue. Henry froze, then glanced at him. You know him. George nodded, throat dry. Everyone did. Back then. He disappeared. 50 years ago. The memory surged, the town-wide search, the unanswered questions, the way adults whispered when they thought the children weren't listening. Thomas's name had become part of local folklore. And here he was, captured in photographs pulled from the river. Henry set the final print aside, his face pale. These aren't just family photos, he murmured. They're pieces of a story. George could only stare at the drying film. The family's joy. The children's innocence. And, at the edges of their happiness, the shadow of a young man who had vanished without trace. The river had not just given him a relic. It had given him evidence. That night, George sat alone at his table again, photographs spread before him. The faces stared back, silent yet insistent. He traced the outlines with his fingers, searching for meaning in every shadow, every gesture. The questions circled like restless birds. Who were the family? Why was Thomas always nearby? Why had these images been buried beneath the river for half a century? He leaned back, weary but alive in a way he hadn't felt in years. The river had pulled him into something larger than himself, and he knew, with the certainty of old bones, that he could not walk away. George could not sleep. The photographs lay across his table, drying in the half-light of the lamp. Each face seemed to breathe, as though the years between then and now had collapsed into the small kitchen. He tried closing his eyes. No use. Every time his lids shut, the faces returned, laughing children, the woman's gentle gaze, the man's easy smile. And always, at the edge of the frame, the shadow, Thomas Hale. By dawn, his decision was made. He couldn't keep this to himself. The river hadn't given him a relic to hoard. It had handed him a burden. He dressed quickly, tucked a stack of the clearest photographs into an envelope, and stepped into the cool morning air. The town was waking. Smoke curled from chimneys. A dog barked at nothing. George walked steady, his heart thudding harder than the rhythm of his boots on the pavement. The barber shop came first. Old man Carver had been cutting hair longer than George had been alive. If anyone remembered Thomas Hale, it would be him. The bell above the door jingled as George entered. Carver looked up from his chair, spectacles sliding low on his nose. Morning, George. Need a trim? Not today, George muttered. His hand trembled slightly as he slid the envelope onto the counter. I need you to look at something. Carver pulled the photos out, squinting. The color drained from his cheeks. His hands, once steady with scissors, shook. Well, I'll be, he whispered. That's Tom. Haven't seen his face in 50 years. He looked up sharply. Where did you get these? George explained simply. The river, the camera, Henry's workshop. Carver's eyes narrowed with a mix of awe and fear. Best keep this quiet, the barber muttered. Folks, they don't like stirring old ghosts. George left uneasy, but he couldn't stop. At the grocery, he showed the images to Mrs. Lane, retired now but sharp as a tack. Her eyes widened. She pressed a hand to her lips. Dear Lord. Tom. I remember him. She traced a finger over the black sedan in the background of one photo. That car. I know whose it was. Belonged to Richard Collins. Powerful man. Dangerous too. Her voice dropped to a whisper. You didn't hear it from me. The whisper spread as he showed the photos to others. An old teacher, a dock worker, a woman who once served drinks at the bar by the river. Each recognized Thomas. Each reacted the same way. Shock, sorrow, unease. The dock worker leaned closer, his voice low. I saw him that night. Standing on the pier. Looked like he had the weight of the world on his shoulders. Next morning, gone. The waitress, frail now but eyes still sharp, trembled as she studied the photo of Tom near the black car. "He argued with Collins that night," she said. "I saw it. I never told the police. Nobody dared." Piece by piece, a puzzle emerged. Not clear, not whole, but the outlines began to form. A family, captured in innocent joy. A young man, always at the edges, staring as though he knew something he shouldn't. A car, sleek and black, owned by the wealthiest, most feared man the town had ever known. George returned home with the envelope heavier than when he left. He spread the photographs once more across the table. This time, they didn't feel like mere pictures. They felt like testimony. Evidence. His heart ached with the weight of it. He wasn't just holding pieces of paper. He was holding voices that had been silenced. The town had buried Thomas Hale's name under decades of silence. Now it was speaking again. And George, fisherman, widower, solitary man of the river, had become its reluctant messenger. That night, as the clock ticked slow and steady, George whispered aloud to the empty kitchen. "All right, Tom. I hear you." The photographs stared back, patient, relentless. And George knew he could not stop. The story had chosen him. The name clung to George's mind like burrs on a coat. Richard Collins. Everyone whispered it. No one said it loudly. Even decades after his death, the weight of that name pressed on the town like a hand on its throat. George sat at his kitchen table again, photographs spread like cards in a gambler's game. The family's joy. The children's laughter caught mid-run. And there, blurred at the edge, Thomas Hale. But what cut deeper now was the car. The black sedan gleamed in the background of one image. Its chrome caught the light in a way no rust or river could erase. Mrs. Lane had been right. It was Collins's car. The sleekest machine in town back then. Everyone knew it. Collins. The man who owned half the factories. The man who paid the police chief's salary under the table. The man whose word bent rules like willow branches. George remembered him from boyhood. A tall figure in polished shoes. A smile that never touched his eyes. When Collins walked into church, men straightened their backs and women lowered their voices. Even children sensed it. Power and fear in equal measure. The more George thought of it, the less the photographs felt accidental. Why was Thomas always near that family? Why was Collins's car nearby? Why had the camera ended up in the river, sealed tight with its story inside? It wasn't chance. It was concealment. Evidence meant to vanish. But the river had betrayed the silence. George needed more. He returned to the library, its air thick with dust and the smell of old paper. He combed through yellowed newspapers, brittle to the touch. Headlines flashed back. Local man missing after fishing trip. Search parties scour the riverbank. No clues in Hale disappearance. Every column circled the same hollow conclusion. No answers. But Collins's name lingered at the edges. Not accused. Not even questioned. Yet always present, donor to the search, sponsor of the vigils, the pillar of the community who stood in photographs shaking hands with sheriffs and judges. It was too neat. Too rehearsed. An elderly librarian approached, her step slow but her eyes sharp. "You're digging up Thomas, aren't you?" she asked softly. George straightened. "You remember." She nodded. "Everyone does. My father was on the search committee. We all knew something was wrong. But Collins kept a long reach. People were scared." She leaned closer, lowering her voice. They whispered Tom had seen something. Something he wasn't meant to. And then, he was gone. George showed her the photo of the black sedan. Her lips thinned, her face drained. "That's Collins's car. I'd stake my life on it." The puzzle sharpened. Collins's shadow stretched over every corner of the story. Tom's disappearance. The silence that followed. The fear that lingered even now. George left the library with his chest heavy, the photographs tucked safe in their envelope. Each step echoed with the weight of truth pressing closer. That evening, Henry studied the images again under the magnifying glass at his bench. "There's more here than we saw before," he muttered. He pointed to a faint reflection in the sedan's window, another figure, standing just out of frame. Too blurred to identify, but present. Watching. George's heart tightened. This wasn't just a boy wandering into the wrong photographs. This was surveillance. Thomas had been there because he was tied to something dangerous. The silence of the town was no longer a mystery. It was fear, calcified over 50 years. Collins had owned not just factories and cars, but the silence of people. And silence had teeth. George leaned back, eyes on the ceiling, the smell of oil and dust sharp in his nose. "Why me?" he muttered. "Why now?" Henry said nothing, but the photographs rustled faintly in the draft, as if answering for themselves. That night, George dreamed of the river. He stood on its banks, nets heavy in his hands. But what he pulled up was not fish, not even the camera. It was a body, pale and nameless, eyes clouded, mouth open as though still trying to speak. He woke drenched in sweat, the sound of the river still in his ears. He rose, poured a drink of water, and stared at the photographs laid neatly on the table. Faces from another time. Smiles already long gone. And Thomas Hale, caught forever in the background, pointing without words toward the truth. George understood now. The river hadn't given him a gift. It had given him a command. Find what happened. End the silence. The town had always carried the silence like a second skin. But silence does not last forever. Once pierced, it begins to bleed. George noticed it first in the way people looked at him. Not curious, not casual. Guarded, as if they knew he was walking with something fragile, something dangerous. He carried the envelope with the photographs everywhere now. He could not leave them behind. Every time he touched the edges, he felt the weight of 50 years pressing against his fingertips. At the dock, he found Eli Turner, once a river worker, now an old man with hands like rope. Eli studied one of the photographs under the grey sky, his lips tightening. "I saw him that night," Eli whispered. Tom, standing at the pier, staring out at the water, looked, worried, like he wanted to leave town but couldn't. George's throat dried. And after that, Eli shook his head. Morning came. He was gone. Just gone. Like the river swallowed him whole. He handed the photo back quickly, as though it burned. Later, George visited the small diner at the edge of town. The waitress, Ruby, still worked there, though time had bent her shoulders and dimmed her voice. When she saw the photo of Tom near the black sedan, her face drained of color. "I remember that night," she said softly. He came in, sat by the window. Collins joined him. They argued, quiet, but sharp. I heard Tom say something like, "I won't keep quiet." Her eyes darted around the diner, even now, even after Collins had been dead for decades. She lowered her voice. Next morning, Tom was gone. Nobody asked questions. Nobody dared. The cracks widened. Everywhere George went, the photographs loosened tongues. A retired teacher spoke of Tom's honesty, his stubborn refusal to bow to men like Collins. A mechanic admitted he had repaired Collins's car the very week Tom vanished, a dent in the bumper that was never explained. A former deputy confessed, hand shaking, that the investigation into Tom's disappearance had been ordered to stop from higher up. Higher up. Everyone knew what that meant. Each piece slid into place, not cleanly, but jagged, like shards of broken glass. Together they formed a picture that was hard to deny. Tom Hale had not simply vanished. He had been silenced. The family in the photos, smiling, unaware, was somehow tied to him. And Collins's car lingered at the edge like a shadow with teeth. George sat with Henry one evening, the photograph spread once again across the workbench. Henry leaned over the sedan picture, his magnifying glass catching the lamplight. "Look here," Henry murmured. "The reflection in the window. That's not Tom. That's someone else." George squinted. A blurred outline. A man. Watching. Unclear, but real. His stomach twisted. This was no accident, no coincidence. These photographs had been buried because they contained truths, dangerous truths. At night, George's dreams grew heavier. He saw Tom standing in the fog, eyes hollow, lips moving but no sound coming. He saw the black car's headlights cutting across the riverbank. He saw the family laughing, unaware of the shadow at their door. He woke gasping, sweat dampening his pillow. Each time, he found himself staring at the envelope on the table. The past had dug its claws into him and refused to let go. By week's end, George knew the town was shifting. Whispers ran through the square, at the barber's, at the church steps. People spoke the name again. Thomas Hale. Not as a ghost, not as a cautionary tale, but as a man. The silence was cracking, and with every word spoken, with every memory revived, the shadow of Collins seemed less untouchable. George poured himself a cup of coffee late that night. Photographs spread before him once more. He traced Thomas's blurred face with his finger and whispered, "They tried to bury you. But the river wouldn't keep quiet. And neither will I." The house was silent, but George felt, deep inside, that the silence outside was breaking too. The whispers had become steady now. Everywhere George went, the name Thomas Hale hung in the air like smoke. 50 years of silence undone by a handful of photographs. But whispers weren't enough. They hinted, they circled, they trembled. What George needed now was clarity. A turning point. It came from Margaret. He hadn't thought of her in years, Thomas's younger sister. She had moved away long ago, after her parents died. People said she wanted to escape the shadow of her brother's disappearance. When Claire, the young journalist, tracked her down, George agreed to come along. He carried the envelope in his hands, the way a priest carries scripture. Margaret's house stood at the edge of the county, a modest place with shutters painted blue. She opened the door with wary eyes. Her hair was silver now, her back bent, but her gaze cut sharp. Claire explained gently. George opened the envelope and slid the photographs across the table. Margaret's hands trembled as she lifted the first one. Her lips parted. Tears rose. "That's him," she whispered. "My brother. After all these years, there he is." Her voice cracked, and she pressed the photo to her chest as if it were flesh and blood. She studied the others, slower, more deliberate. When she reached the one with the family, her face softened. "I know them," she murmured. "The woman, she worked with my mother at the factory. The children, Tom adored them. He'd babysit when their parents couldn't. They were like family to us." Her eyes clouded. But if Tom was with them in those days, that means... She trailed off, unable to finish. George didn't press. He didn't need to. The implication hung in the air. Tom hadn't been wandering into random photos. He had been woven into their lives. Then Margaret's hand froze over the picture with the black sedan. Her face drained of color. "That car," she whispered. Her eyes darted to George. "You know whose it was, don't you?" George nodded grimly. "Collins." Margaret's jaw tightened. She set the photo down as if it had burned her. "My father never trusted him. Said he had hands in everything. Money, politics, even the police. Tom used to tell me he saw things at the factory, things that didn't sit right. Deals made behind closed doors. Deliveries at night. He said Collins's men were moving things they didn't want the law to see." Her voice dropped lower. One evening, Tom came home pale as death. He said, "If anything happens to me, you'll know why." The next week, he was gone. George felt the weight of her words settle like stone in his chest. The puzzle was snapping into place. Thomas hadn't vanished by accident. He had seen too much. And Collins, the man everyone feared, had made sure silence followed. That night, George returned home with Margaret's words echoing in his ears. He spread the photographs again, tracing the faces, the car, the blurred shadows. They were no longer fragments. They were testimony. But what struck him most wasn't just Collins's shadow. It was the innocence of the family. Smiling children, a devoted mother, a proud father. They had been caught in the same web. And Tom, standing near them, half in shadow, had tried to protect something, or someone. Sleep didn't come easily. When it did, George dreamed of voices, children laughing, then fading into cries. A car door slamming. A figure standing at the edge of the dock, staring at him with hollow eyes. He woke with a start, heart hammering. The river's smell lingered in his mind, damp and heavy, as though it had followed him into the room. The next day, Claire published another article. This time, Margaret's testimony was printed in black and white. The photographs were there too. The town could no longer look away. People gathered in church halls, in diners, in front of shops. They whispered less now. They spoke. Stories surfaced, snippets of memory, suspicions long buried. Together they painted a picture of Collins not as a benefactor, but as a predator cloaked in respectability. For George, it was both relief and dread. The silence was broken. But once silence breaks, truth demands to be followed to the end. He looked again at Thomas's blurred face, always at the edge, always watching. And he whispered, almost as a vow, "I'm not stopping now." The silence had cracked. Now the cracks were spreading fast. Too fast. George felt it first in the stairs. Men at the diner who once nodded politely now avoided his eyes. Women at the grocery hushed their voices when he passed. Even the pastor, who usually shook his hand after service, pressed his lips tight and turned away. It wasn't just curiosity. It was fear. The photographs had done their work. And not everyone was glad. Claire's article had set the town buzzing. Margaret's testimony, the images, the name of Collins. The old pillars of silence were collapsing. But in their place came unease. Danger. George noticed a car parked near his house one evening. Engine idling. Headlights off. When he stepped onto the porch, the car rolled away slow, as if reluctant to leave. His stomach nodded. Collins might be dead, but shadows have long legs. At Henry's shop, they studied the photographs again. Henry frowned, tapping the reflection in the car window. "Whoever that is," he said, "they're not part of the family. And they're not Tom either. Someone else was there. Watching." George's skin prickled. Another man. Another secret. Henry leaned closer, lowering his voice. "You've stirred something, George. People are talking in ways they haven't in decades. That's good, but it also means someone won't want this story out." The tension grew heavier with each passing day. George felt it in the way doors closed quickly when he approached, in the phone calls that went silent when he picked up, in the newspaper's office window, cracked one morning by a thrown rock. Claire brushed it off with a brave smile, but George saw the flicker of fear in her eyes. "We are hitting nerves," she said, "which means we are close." The town's younger generation devoured every article, demanding answers. But the older folk, those who remembered Collins firsthand, grew restless. Some begged George to stop. "Let it be," one woman whispered, clutching his arm. "What's gone should stay gone." But George couldn't stop. The river hadn't chosen him for silence. It had chosen him to uncover. One night, Margaret called. Her voice shook. "Someone came to my door," she whispered. "Knock hard." Didn't say a word. When I opened, no one was there, but the photographs I left on my table had been moved. George felt the blood drain from his face. It wasn't just fear now. It was warning. Sleep became a stranger. He sat at his table night after night, photographs spread before him like a map to some buried treasure. But treasure wasn't the right word. It was evidence. A record that someone still wanted erased. He traced Thomas's blurred figure again and again. A man caught in shadows. A man silenced too soon. And he felt it like a command, not just a choice. Don't stop. Don't turn back. One evening, George returned from the river to find his front door ajar. He froze, heart hammering. Inside, nothing was stolen. But the envelope was gone. Panic surged through him like a storm tide. The photographs, the proof, snatched away. He staggered to the table, fists trembling. The towel he had left folded neatly beneath the envelope was still there, mocking him with its emptiness. But an hour later, a knock came at the door. He opened it to find the envelope lying on the porch, untouched. Someone had taken it. Someone had held it. Someone had chosen to put it back. The message was clear. "We can reach you anytime." George closed the door and bolted it tight. His hand shook as he gathered the photographs once more. They looked the same, but they felt different. Tainted now. Marked. The past was no longer just memory. It was alive. And it was pushing back. That night, George whispered into the empty kitchen. "All right. If you want me quiet, you should have left the river alone." The photographs glowed faintly under the lamp, their faces calm, their shadows restless. George's fear hardened into resolve. The past was fighting to stay buried. But he would not let it. The river had always whispered to George. But now, its voice felt louder, urgent. As if it knew he was getting close to something that others wanted left in the mud. The tension in town was no longer subtle. People stared when he passed. Some offered quick nods of support, others turned away with tight jaws. The past had been stirred, and not everyone wanted it dragged into daylight. George felt it in his bones. The story was reaching its edge. One evening, Claire arrived at his house with fire in her eyes. "They tried to scare us off," she said, holding up a note slipped under the newspaper's office door. The words were scrawled in uneven ink. "Drop it or pay." George read it twice, then set it down gently. He'd expected threats. What he hadn't expected was the calm that settled over him. "Then we are close," he said simply. Claire nodded, though her hands trembled. The next day, George took the photographs to the town meeting. It was the first time he had shown them in public, to more than a few trusted eyes. The community hall was half full: old men, worried women, curious teenagers. The photos lay spread across a long wooden table, the lamplight catching their faded edges. Gasps filled the room as people leaned closer. Whispers rippled. "That's Tom." "God, after all these years." "Look, Collins's car." An older man in the corner stood abruptly. His face was pale, but his voice carried. "Enough," he barked. "This doesn't prove anything. Collins has been dead for decades. Let the man rest. Let the past rest." But George rose, his voice firm, steady. "No. This proves plenty. Thomas Hale didn't just vanish. He was there. With this family. Near Collins's car. Again and again. These are not coincidences." He looked across the faces, their fear mixing with hunger for truth. Tom was silenced. And we all know it. We lived under that silence. Some of you still carry it. A murmur spread. Some nodded in agreement. Others sat rigid, unwilling to meet his eyes. Then Margaret, frail but unyielding, pushed herself up from a seat. Her voice cracked, but it filled the hall. "My brother didn't run away. He didn't abandon us. He was taken from us, by Collins, by his power, by this town's silence. 50 years we've carried this wound. I won't die without the truth spoken." The hall fell quiet. Tears streaked her cheeks, but her eyes shone with defiance. It was then George saw him, a man near the back, leaning against the wall, arms crossed. Stranger, yet not. Older, heavyset, but the resemblance struck him, the jawline, the eyes. Collins's son. He hadn't lived in town for years, but here he was now, drawn back by the noise. His stare was cold, unflinching. "You think you can smear my father's name with old pictures and rumors," he said, voice low, dangerous. "You're dragging ghosts for nothing. My father built this town. You all lived on his wages, under his roof. Don't forget that." The air thickened. Some shifted nervously. Others looked at the floor. But George did not flinch. He met the man's glare head-on. "Your father built his empire on fear, and he buried a young man to protect it. The river gave back what he tried to hide, and I won't bury it again." Collins's son sneered. "You're an old fool chasing shadows. Careful, or you'll regret it." He turned sharply and left, the slam of the door echoing through the hall. The meeting dissolved into nervous chatter, but something had changed. The truth had been spoken out loud, in public. No more whispers. No more secrets traded behind closed doors. The confrontation had torn away the last veil. Everyone knew now, whether they admitted it or not. That night, George sat at his kitchen table once more, the photographs laid neatly before him. He was tired. Bone-deep tired. But beneath the fatigue was resolve. For the first time, he felt he wasn't carrying the weight alone. Margaret, Claire, even some of the townsfolk. The burden had shifted. The silence was no longer absolute. He traced Thomas's face with a steady finger. "You're not forgotten," he whispered. "Not anymore." The river outside flowed as it always had. But to George, its voice was different now. Not just whispering, but urging, carrying him toward the final reckoning. The past was alive. And it demanded its ending. The river moved slow that morning. Mist rose from its surface, soft and pale, curling like memory. George sat in his boat, oars resting, eyes on the ripples. The current carried the same song it always had. But to him, it sounded different now. Less secretive. Almost relieved. Weeks had passed since the town meeting. Claire's articles had spread far beyond the county. Reporters from bigger papers arrived, hungry for a story about a missing man, a powerful family, and a silence that had lasted 50 years. Margaret spoke bravely, holding her brother's name steady in the light. Others followed, dockworkers, clerks, waitresses, offering fragments of memory once locked behind fear. Together, those fragments wove a truth no one could deny. Thomas Hale hadn't vanished. He had been silenced. Collins's empire had swallowed him whole. And the town, out of fear, had turned its face away. No body was found. No official file reopened. No judge's gavel struck. Justice, in the clean sense, would never come. But acknowledgement. That was something. Recognition. The truth carried in voices at last. And sometimes that was enough. George walked the streets now with a different weight. People met his eyes. Some nodded in gratitude. Others avoided him still, but their silence no longer carried power. It carried shame. At the diner, Ruby refilled his coffee without being asked. At the library, the old woman patted his hand and whispered, "Thank you." Even Carver the barber, once reluctant, placed a hand on George's shoulder. "Tom deserved to be remembered," he said softly. Margaret invited George to her home one evening. Her children and grandchildren gathered around, wide-eyed as she told stories of her brother, his stubborn honesty, his laugh, the way he carried her on his shoulders when she was small. George sat quietly, the photographs in his lap. When he passed them around, the family studied them with reverence, as if they were holding pieces of their own bloodline. Margaret's tears fell, but her smile was steady. "For 50 years, we had only questions," she whispered. "Now, at least, we have answers. Not all, but enough." Back in his kitchen, George kept one photograph pinned to the wall. Not of the car, not of the shadows, not of the proof, but of the children running in the yard, hair flying, faces alive with joy. Because that was what Tom had died near, ordinary life, worth protecting. And that was what Collins, with all his power, could never erase. One morning, George returned to the river with only a rod, no nets, no bag. He rowed to the bend, the place where it had begun. The water lapped softly at the hull. He stared at the surface, remembering the weight of the net, the first glimpse of rust and leather. The river had chosen him. Why? He could not say. But he knew he had listened. And that was enough. He spoke aloud, his voice low but steady. "Tom, wherever you are, you're not forgotten. Not anymore. The river gave you back. And I gave you forward. That's all I had to give." The mist carried his words across the water. For a moment, George swore the current slowed, listening. When he rowed home, the sun broke free of the clouds, scattering light across the water. The town, with all its scars, with all its buried secrets, stood waiting. But it was lighter now. The silence had been broken. George tied up his boat and stepped onto the dock. He was old, tired, his hands rough with years. But his heart carried something new. Not loneliness, not grief, but peace. The past had surfaced. The truth had spoken. And though justice had come late, it had come nonetheless. Sometimes justice is not punishment. Sometimes it is remembering. Sometimes it is simply saying a name aloud, so it will never be lost again. Thomas Hale. George whispered the name one last time as he walked home, the river flowing behind him, endless, eternal. And for the first time in many years, he smiled.